In today's video, we are going to be going on a journey of transformation as I take two of my hand knit sweaters and over dye them into two completely different colors. There's a lot to unpack with this. There's a lot of ups and downs and emotions and anxieties, and I'm really excited to take you along with me. Hello, and welcome to this Wool Needles Hands midweek ramble vlog video. I'm really excited for this video because this is something I've been wanting to share for quite some time, and ever since I posted the last ramble video where I over dyed some yarn for a viewer, I've been kind of supercharged and motivated to give this a shot. Now, I have heard a lot of people express interest in this particular thing, and so I'm hoping that you leave here today with a little bit of inspiration and maybe a little bit of motivation to do this yourself. Just know going into this is not really considered a step-by-step tutorial, but as all of these kind of process videos that I produce here, it's more of a jumping off point from which I hope you learn a lot. So what is it that I'm talking about? Well, I am in my dye studio clothes. I am ready to go out into my dye studio. As many of you know, I am the owner and dyer of Fiber for the People yarn, and I dye all of my yarn from my home studio out in the garage of our house. I'm going to be going out there today and getting started over dyeing a couple of sweaters that I have in my wardrobe. Now, I've heard lots of people talking about wanting to have this as an option. Perhaps we purchase yarn and we knit a garment with that yarn, only to realize that the color is just not for us. It doesn't go with our skin tone. We don't really like the way that it worked up into a fabric. Lots of different reasons that you may just want to give it a fresh coat of paint, as I like to say. And so I'm hoping that today we can do that together in two different instances and possibly inspire folks to take the horse by the reins, give their sweaters a fresh dye job, and have them be wearable all over again. So the two sweaters that I have here today just happen to be Felix Pullovers by Amy Christoffers. The colors that I have here are both Fiber for the People colors, and at the time of knitting these projects, I loved the colors in and of themselves. I even love the way that they look in the fabric here. I just don't love these colors on my skin tone, and so I really need to rethink the colors of these sweaters as opposed to the idea of donating them, giving them away. I'd really like to have them be something I can wear that work for me. So let me show you, and actually what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my camera. I'm gonna put these on Gladys, my dress form, so that you can see them in proper lighting. We'll talk a little bit about the color and then we'll go from there. Okay, here is sweater number one. So as you can see, it's a really lovely kind of rosy mauve pink color. It's really a fantastic color. It's just not for me. It's generally a solid color here. There's a little bit of a tonality. You can see some variations in the depth of the color, but overall it's pretty solid. So this is going to give us an idea of what it would be like to over dye a solid color sweater. Not only that, you can see that there is a delicate halo here. I knit this using a 100% non-superwash or untreated merino yarn with a kid mohair silk strand held double. So we're going to be seeing how over dyeing can work with a fabric like that. So this is sweater number one in this really lovely dusty rose mauve color. Let's go ahead and pull out sweater number two. Okay, here is sweater number two. Now this sweater color is more challenging for me. As you can see, I didn't alternate skeins here, so I have this big area of flashing happening right here, which I never have loved. It's all over variegated color. You can see lots of color changes happening in there. So this is going to give us an idea of what would happen to the fabric if it's over dyed in a solid color on top of a variegated color, which is going to be really interesting. I honestly don't know how that's going to work out. I have a little bit of an idea of what might happen, and I think it's going to be lovely, but it's going to be an adventure nonetheless. I've worn this sweater in the past and it's been okay, but this particular range of colors just doesn't call out to me. It doesn't suit me very well, and I feel like the one thing that holds me back from wearing this most, besides the fact that it's quite cropped, is the color. So I'm really excited to play around with over dyeing this particular colorway, considering it is so variegated, and then also just giving myself a cute little cropped short sleeve sweater to put back into my wardrobe. Okay, so for the color, what I decided I was going to do in terms of deciding what I want to do to over dye this, what color I'm trying to achieve, is I decided I was going to go to my stash and look through yarns that I already have and see which colors are calling to me. That if I could have a sweater in one of those colors in like 2 or 3 days, which one would I want? Because that's kind of what we're doing here. We are giving ourselves a new sweater that we knit ourselves with our own 2 hands. We're just giving it a new look, which gives it a new life, making it a new garment altogether. And it's kind of cool to think about taking a color of some yarn that you have in your stash and saying, I love that color. I would like a sweater in that color, but I don't need to knit that entire sweater right now. I'm going to over dye this other sweater in that color and kind of experience that instant gratification. And so that's what I did. So I pulled 2 little skeins or balls of yarn from my stash that I would like to use as my inspiration for over dyeing these sweaters. And I have them right here. So this one here is a K&C knit and crochet from Joanne, and it is this gorgeous rust color. Absolutely love this. Oh God, it's so good. And then I have this. This is a Knit Pick Swish worsted, and it's this really pretty like purpley navy color. Oh, and you know what? If you've been watching the podcast, hold on. Okay, so this yarn is my Green Mountain Spinnery yarn that I almost put into a D-stash. Notice the similarity? This one's more purple, but here's the thing. I love them, and actually I've really grown to love this one quite a bit. Yeah, I like this. And I think it would look pretty nice on me as kind of like a neutral navy color. And so I was thinking that if I went for this navy color that you see here, and I dyed this sweater here, this is my kind of rosy mauve Felix, I would land on a warm reddish undertone navy like you're seeing here. So I am planning on going for navy for this sweater, and I feel like that is going to be not a risk, but a challenge. Not too much of a challenge because this is a rather light color, and dyeing a dark color over the top of a light color is much more doable. And because this is already a warm hue, whatever I dye over the top of this is going to take on a really nice warm undertone, kind of like what you're seeing happening in this one. So that's my plan. This rosy one, I'm going to be over dyeing a navy. And then this guy, sorry Gladys, is what I am going to strive for with this little number. I mean, how cute. A little cropped short sleeve sweater like this, but in this all over color. Like, come on. I love it. So pretty. I feel like it goes well with my skin tone. Ugh, I think it's going to be great. And what I love about this is that there are already a lot of those like warm, earthy colors in there. So adding something like this over the top is going to bring out the colors like that are already in there and really make those spots pop. And then the lighter areas are going to cause this to be like pop with brightness. The darker areas are going to give it more depth. So the result, my hypothesis about the result here is that I'm going to have a really tonal all over color. I'm confident that this rusty color is going to cover this completely, but I think because this is so variegated, there's definitely going to be a lot of tonality there, and I think it's going to be good. I'm a little concerned. I'm a little concerned that this is going to be maintained. Like this little like flashing section might not go away completely, and my idea of how I might remedy that or disguise that is if I add a little bit of a teeny tiny bit of black to whatever I create to create this color, or even gray, which means it's not going to be quite as bright as this, but that like moodiness in tone might neutralize the brightness of that flashing. And that's kind of what I'm thinking. So whatever I do to dye over this, and I really am going to shoot for this, I want it to have kind of like a moody undertone to, like I said, help neutralize all those little, maybe like undesirable pops of color. So that is the direction we're going to go with this. We're shooting for a rust and we're shooting for a navy over dye. Next step right now, the first thing that you want to do if you're going to over dye your sweaters is you want to get them soaking. You want them to be completely saturated with water. Don't worry so much about washing them. You could wash them with like Eucalyptus or a wool wash, but at this point we don't want to add any kind of lanolin back into the fiber. We just want to leave them like they are, soak them in water. Do not even touch acid at this point. Now, and the reason I bring this up, because these are wool sweaters, in order to dye these, we have to use acid dye. That means it is dye that fixes to the yarn using some form of acid, and that's how you dye protein fiber. I talk a lot about this in my yarn dyeing series here on YouTube, which I will link to at the end of this episode if you'd like to really take a deep dive. But just know you need acid dye. I will link to that down below in the description box. You need some form of acid. You can use vinegar, you can use citric acid. I will be using citric acid. And then of course you'll need the hot water and all of this. I will not be adding any form of acid to the water that this soaks in or to the water that I dye this in until way late in the game. And that is because I prefer a gradual uptake of color. I want the most even dye job in this particular instance as possible. So before I do anything, I want to soak these and let them soak for at least 2 hours. And just know, you don't need a dye studio for this. This is something you can absolutely do in your kitchen. Not the soaking part necessarily, but the dyeing part. For soaking sweaters, a really great place to do that is in your bathtub. Okay, so let's go ahead and head out to the dye studio and get these soaking. Talk a little bit about dye for a second. Now, as you can see behind me, I have lots to choose from, but if you are not a professional yarn dyer, if it's not what you do for a living, you're probably not going to have all of the different dyes to choose from. So what I'm going to tell you right now is that there are 2 different places I would recommend going for your acid dye needs. The first one is Pro Chemical and Dye. They sell a great range of colors in a Washfast acid dye, and you can even get small little quantities of dye like the one that you see here, which is perfect for this application. This is going to be way more than you need if you're only going to be over dyeing one sweater, so that is something to keep in mind. However, this is pretty good if you think that this might be something that you do more frequently. That is my air conditioner turning on. Just a second. You might hear that every once in a while. Our like furnace and the unit for our AC is in here, so it can get noisy from time to time. I do believe that you can purchase sample quantities of this or smaller quantities if you are doing something small like over dyeing a single sweater, but Pro Chemical and Dye is a great place to go. I will link to this down below. Another really great option is Dharma Trading Company. So this is the dye from Dharma Trading Company. It is an acid dye as well. It is Washfast, just like Pro Chemical and Dye, but that is not in the name of the product. It is just considered acid dye. It is specifically for protein fibers like wool, silk, and then it also works on nylon. Just know if you are working with something like this, it comes in a powder form. It's a very fine powder. It can get into the air. And so it's really important that if you are going to be doing something like that, that you use some kind of a respirator mask. If this is the only time you're going to be dyeing yarn, a medical mask works fine. A painter's mask is great. If you think you're going to break into it and do it far more frequently, you might want to get something like this. I will link to the mask that I use down below in the description box. And then of course, you're gonna want gloves, maybe an apron, all of these things, common sense things to consider when you're doing something like dyeing yarn. Okay, let's talk color theory for a minute because I am going to be adding color over the top of already established color. And in the case of that variegated sweater, several established colors. And so I just have to have color theory in the back of my mind. All right, this is your basic color wheel. It has your 3 primary colors, your yellow, your red, and your blue. And then it has your secondary and tertiary colors all the way around the color wheel. It's really a beautiful thing. Now, one thing I will tell you, if we make this really quick and dirty, if you work your way around the arc of a color wheel in terms of adding color or mixing colors together, you're going to end up with various versions of the closest primary color. So if you start with the primary color blue and you add yellow, you're going to work your way around to green, or if you begin adding more reds, you're going to work your way around to red. Now, you can't go from blue to red, so, you know, just in theory, that's kind of how the color wheel works. But what I will, and that just means that these colors that work themselves around the arc kind of blend nicely together. When it comes to mixing, you can mix them together to achieve really lovely secondary and tertiary colors. Now, when you go across the color wheel, directly across the color wheel, that's where you run the risk of moving into brown territory. For example, if I find that my base color that I'm dyeing is kind of a violet blue, and I'm thinking about adding a little bit of an orangey yellow to kind of give it a new color, I'm really going to be running into what would equate to muddy brown. You don't want to cross the color wheel when it comes to blending colors together. When you do want to cross the color wheel is when you put colors next to each other. For example, if you're doing a really lovely color work project, choosing colors that are across the color wheel from one another is always a smart move because those are complementary colors. They kind of appeal to the eye when you see them next to one another and they have a nice contrast. But when you're trying to blend colors together to move in the direction of a different hue, you want to work your way around the color wheel. So in the case of the sweaters that I'm going to be over dyeing here, let's go ahead and think a little bit about that rosy sweater. It falls in and around this area right here. Of course, it's not quite as rich and vibrant as what you see here, but it falls within that area of the color wheel. If I add, and bear in mind, I'm trying to get to a navy blue color with that particular sweater. If I add more blue to that rosy color, I'm going to move into the realm of violet. The sweater already has a rosy undertone or a rosy base color, so adding blue over the top of that is going to move me closer to violet. And if I continue to add blue, then I will continue to reach that really lovely navy, warm navy color. Now, you can see that it moves towards green. I'm not going to get to green by adding continual layers of blue. I kind of will eventually just stop at the deepest blue that I can get, but that's the direction that I want to go with this. I want to continue to add layers of blue to that already established rosy color to help me get to that really lovely violet navy. Now, in terms of that earthy sweater that has all of those little earth tones in there, and because I'm shooting for something that's more in like the dark rust department, I'm going to need, and it's kind of hard to put it on this color wheel where that already established color sits. I would say it's just kind of in, I don't know, it's like in this region somewhere. I just need to really start adding more oranges and reds, and then again, maybe adding a little bit of that gray and black to really deepen that overall color and hope to get that lovely rust color. All I would say to you for the case of this is to work yourself around the color wheel. Try to stick to a gradual change in color, working around the color wheel. Don't cross over the color wheel when it comes to adding colors to that already established color, because you run the risk of turning it into a muddy brown. Now, if you're going for a really lovely earthy brown color, which could very well be your objective, some of the most beautiful earthy browns come from doing just that. For example, if you mix purple and yellow, the brown that comes from that is actually quite lovely. But if that's not what you're intending and you're not expecting that, it can be disappointing, and dyeing over the top of brown is really difficult when you're trying to change it to something completely different. It takes lots and lots of layers to do that. So just bear that in mind. When you jump across the color wheel, you run the risk of coming into like a muddy brown color or even an earthy brown color or a warm brown, but you're definitely going to get some form of brown. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some of the colors, the dyes I have here. It's gonna be hard to see all the different labels, but I kind of know what I'm looking at. And I'm thinking we're gonna start with that blush colored sweater to begin with. Now, I could go the route of navy like you see right here in this jar. However, that navy tends to have a lot of red in it. In fact, when you mix the dye stock with that particular navy, it looks like you're mixing a red dye. It's kind of bizarre. And I don't know if I want to go with a blue that's going to already have a lot of red in it, since I'm adding it over the top of an already rosy, warm color sweater. So I'm looking for something that is blue without a lot of red. And I'm just kind of walking around looking at what I have here. You know what? I think I have a dye called Peacock Blue, and I actually think that that could be fabulous. I need to find my Peacock Blue. Where are you? You would think that I have some kind of like organization for all of my dyes so I know where all of them are, but that's just not the way I operate. It's funny because I become pretty accustomed with where I keep each particular color. But in the case of Peacock Blue, I am at a loss. Where are you, Peacock Blue? There he is, right there. Peacock Blue is a little bit more on the kind of like blue-green side. I mean, if I had to like give it a color on my color wheel, I would say that Peacock Blue kind of, I don't know, it sits like in this area right here. It's not a lot of green, but I mean, it's a peacock blue color. So if you know what a peacock looks like, you can kind of imagine. So I think layering that over the top of my rosy sweater could help because it doesn't have a lot of red established. And then because that one tends to have that more greeny blue or cool blue, if you will, I want to add something a little deeper to that. Okay, and then the next blue I think I'm going to use is this one right here. This is called National Blue, and it is a pretty much, you know, a blue. It's just a classic blue color. In fact, I will show you what National Blue looks like. So yeah, here we are. So right here, National Blue is this one right here. That is a true blue. And then that Peacock Blue, like I was saying, I think this is not the same company as this dye here, but if I had to choose one of these blues to be Peacock Blue, just to give you an idea, I would say it's closer to this one here. Yeah, so I'm going to start with those two colors, National Blue and Peacock Blue, to layer over that rosy sweater to get it up to navy. And I think I'm probably going to need to use my best friend Toner Black, my favorite black dye. And okay, so this one, ooh, I might need to second guess that. This is a warm black. There is a lot of russet colors that make this black. So I might need to consider using Pro Chemical and Dye Black because this is a much cooler black. And because we're already dyeing a warm color underneath, meaning that our base color is warm, I might need to stay away from this warm black. So we'll see. We'll kind of play it by ear. Okay, let's look at this again. This, let's find, you know, okay, so here are some samples of some yarn colors. What we're going for with that one russet color is kind of in between this one here and, oh, I don't know, it's pretty close to that, but with a little bit more of an orange undertone. I don't know if that, you can see that there. And that is Brick. I could see where Brick would be a good option. Bright orange, this brick color. Okay, Toffee is this. Where are you? This is Toffee. Can you see that there? That's like too yellow. So I'm mixing Toffee. Sorry, Toffee, not today. But we're gonna go Brick. There is Brick. Okay, so we've got Brick right here. Let's not, oh, Okay, so there is Brick. Let's go ahead and clean up the catastrophe that just happened. Here, let's take Brick and add it to what I have. So we've got Brick and we've got Bright Orange. Okay, I think that could work for that sweater. Brick and Bright Orange. I need to add some depth to that. And I could do it using black. But you know what? I'm almost wondering if I could just do it using like a really rich brown, like a nut brown color. But I don't want to add any more color like that. So I think what I'm going to do is go with Toner Black for this particular sweater because it's a warm black. We're going to keep all the warms over here, even though the base of that sweater is pretty warm and kind of natural with those earth tones. I'm still going to stick with warm colors over the top. Over here, however, because I have so much warmth, because the color is actually a mauve, you know, pinky color, I'm going to stick with cooler colors to get to that lovely navy. So I think we have it to start. This is where I'm going to start. This is my jumping off point for each of those sweaters. Let's go ahead and see how those sweaters are doing. Yeah. They have some more time in there. Okay, here's the next thing that we need to talk about. And this is the part that can become kind of obnoxious, because it's where I'm going to tell you that you need to have a certain size of vessel to dye your sweater in, so that the sweater can move around and not get kind of stifled in the water, where you might notice that dye accumulates in areas and then you have something that kind of looks like a weird, you know, tie-dyed mess, whatever. So just know that I have a variety of vessels behind me, and you may or may not have access to these particular vessels. If you are dyeing, you kind of have to think about the size of your sweater. We are all various different shapes and sizes, and so the garments that we over dye will range in size. So you might have somebody who is really little, who has or is a child or something like that, that you are over dyeing a sweater that is really small, and it can handle being dyed in something as small as this, okay? And this is small. This is, I don't even know, how many is this? 10, 12 quarts? Yeah, this is a 12 quart stock pot. So that may work. But if you are an adult and you are dyeing a full size sweater, meaning it's a long sleeve sweater. Ugh, I have been scanning up yarn and I feel like I'm getting it in my eyelashes. Okay. If you're an adult and you need to dye a full-size sweater, you're going to need more space than this. This is just not enough space to work for a full-size sweater, at least not the ones that I am over dyeing today. So behind me, you will see an array of sizes. I'm going to make sure it's all visible here. So yeah, so we have this one over here, which I believe, I don't know the size of this pot. So we have this one here. We can just use my head as a reference. So this is one that could be used for a smaller sweater. I'm not comfortable using this for my sweaters today. Well, I don't know. I'd have to get the sweater in there with the water and test it out. So this is an option. You also can do something like this. This is a full-sized, double-depth hotel pan that I use for dyeing larger quantities of yarn. One of the reasons I like the idea of using this is because I can lay the sweater in the pan and kind of flatten it out in the water. And I think that that's a really great thing. I get nervous though, because I worry that the sweater is gonna bunch up lengthwise. I'm just not sure. I'm probably going to try it with just some water and see how the sweater moves around. I'm thinking that larger rose-colored sweater at this point, but I'm not sure. So I have this stock pot. This one is, I don't know. It's much bigger. So this was the other one I showed you. The bottoms. This one is just, has much more space on the inside. It's dirty on the inside. It's kind of been sitting on my shelf. This is another one that I could use. I think I'm going to be using this one for the cropped short sleeve sweater. I think it'll move around in there nicely, give me lots of room to kind of like lift it and stir it around so that the dye really takes evenly to the sweater. So that's kind of what I'm thinking for that one. Now, my big Bertha pot, pardon the expression, is this one. Now, I picked up this pot on Amazon quite some time ago. It's by the Bayou Classic Company. What is it? I keep looking at the bottom like it's gonna give me some magical, I don't know the size of this. What I will do is link to these sizes down on the description box, but just you see how large this is. Like you could put like a small baby in there. That just, it's big, it's large. Look at this, okay? This, if I fill this about 3/4 of the way with water, this will allow that full-size sweater that I'm working with here, that rose-colored sweater, to move around really well. And I really want it to be able to do that because I don't want to risk having like little flashes of color in the armpits or the areas where things fold on each other. It's different when you're dyeing yarn because we're working with strands of yarn that can move around quite easily. But when you have something that's knit into a fabric, you really kind of have to be conscious about how it sits in the water. So I feel like the safe bet for me is to dye that sweater in this particular vessel. It doesn't have to be filled all the way with water. It's just going to give it more capacity to move around in the water. Now you might be thinking, well, I don't have all of these things at home, Taylor. I'm a normal, person who does not have a yarn dyeing business. What am I supposed to do? with what I already have? Well, I will tell you this, whatever you use to dye your sweater in can no longer be used for food, so you have that going for you. And also another thing, none of this stuff needs to be top of the line expensive. Go to a thrift store, find some stock pots, nothing non-stick, no Teflon, nothing like that. Aluminum is okay, but I would stick with stainless steel if you're going to be using a convection burner or something like that. You really cannot go wrong with that giant one that I showed you last. If you think this is something that you may want to do in the future for sweaters, for blankets, or whatever, it's a good size to have. Keep it out in your garage, whatever. You can get that size of stock pot on the cheap. It doesn't have to be expensive. So I will say that. So yes, I acknowledge that there are things here that you need to have in your possession to do this, and that can come at an expense, because, you know, we can't dye sweaters in a bucket like you would with like RIT dye that you get at Walmart with a cotton t-shirt or something like that. You need to have heat. You need to have heat for a length of time. It needs to be on a burner, on a stove. You need stock pot or sheet pan, hotel pan type vessels to make that work. Okay, I have this bucket with my sweaters in it right here. I'm gonna go ahead and begin putting the smaller sweater into that smaller pot. I'm gonna just squish it out gently here. You really don't need to squeeze the water out. I mean, it's going right back into water, so just know that it is going to increase how much water you have in your pot and raise it up, so you don't want to have too much water in the pot that it overflows when you put the sweater inside. Okay, let's look. Okay, so we have in the smaller pot my smaller sweater. Let's see if I can... There you go. All right, you can see it in there. It's floating around nicely. I'm able to kind of open the sweater up and it moves around pretty well. Okay, I think that's good. Now over here, you can see in here that there is a lot of space in that pot, and that's fantastic. I mean, I have plenty of room for this thing to move around in the water, and I need that. I need it to be able to move around quite a bit because that is a solid color. I really want even application, and that's gonna really help make that possible. So that is fantastic. It's a little overkill. I mean, there's a lot of extra space in there, but I have the vessel and I may as well use it. Okay, here we go. Now it is time to don the mask and the gloves, and in this case, the apron, and we can get to mixing these dyes to over dye my sweaters. Okay, the first stock that I'm gonna be making right now is the blue that I'll be using for that rosy colored sweater. So I'm starting with this national blue color, and then we will add some peacock blue, and then I plan on toning that with some black. I'm gonna start relatively small because I can always add more later, and I think I'm gonna mix it in this jar so that you can see what it looks like. All right. I use a little milk frother like this. It really does a great job mixing up all those dye particles so you don't have any, granulation when you go to dye the sweaters, which can lead to little speckly bits of dye on the fabric. I'm also using a kettle here with boiling water. You need to use boiling water to blend your dye stock, so keep that in mind. Okay, I will begin with 1 teaspoon of peacock blue. I'll be doing half a teaspoon of national blue. Okay, and then I'm gonna go really small. I'm gonna do a 1/16 of a teaspoon for the black. Okay, so here we have the mixture. I know you can't really see too much in there, but I'm gonna go ahead and add the water now. Let's see what we get. Give it a good mix for a good amount of time. It takes longer than you realize to do this, to really get all of that blue mixed in there. Blues granulate quite easily. They tend to be one that you have to really blend for a little longer. And I don't want any granulation. People ask me if this gives off noxious fumes, and it does not. What you're seeing there is just steam from the boiling water. I cannot smell anything, and it does not give off noxious fumes. It's the dry particles that you don't want to breathe in, so you really don't have to worry about that. Okay, before I can add the dye to this, I need to take the sweater out. So I'm gonna pull my sweater out and stick it in a bucket for now. I know that it fits in there nicely. I'm just gonna put it in here for now. There we go. And then we are gonna add the dye stock to the pot. I have a really long spoon that I like to use for this big pot. And I am going to use that here because it allows me to get down to the way bottom of the pot to mix everything up well. Okay, one thing that I like to do here to figure out the saturation level is once I've added the dye stock into the dye bath, I like to take a sample of it in a jar like this to see how saturated the dye is. That gives me an idea of how saturated it's going to be when I add the sweater. Another way you can do this, if you want to be really scientific about it, is to take the flashlight on your phone and shine it through. And you can see how that is quite transparent still. When I take the light away, it looks like it's just black. But when I add the light, you can see that it's still pretty clear. So that tells me that this is not as saturated as I'm going to need, but that's okay. I want less in the beginning. Less is more in the beginning because you can always add more later. Okay, moment of truth for this first sweater. Okay, so I'm gonna add my sweater into the pot carefully, and I wanna add it all at the same time and kind of push it down with my hands to make sure that it's all submerged in the water. Resist the urge to pull it out to look at it right away, and then take the spoon and gently move it around in the water to get it moving. You need to get it moving. You need to be gentle, but you need to get it moving right away to start getting that water to move through the fibers. You're not working with a skein of yarn here with strands that move out of the way readily. You're working with a fabric with stitches that are pretty well in place. So you need to make sure you're moving the water through the fabric. And you're gonna have to do that by feel. You can see the sweater poking out there. All right, let's go ahead and look. We'll go ahead just to satisfy our curiosity and look at what we have so far. So here is what we have so far, and you can see that there's an uneven distribution of color here. You wanna keep that in there. Let's pull up another spot. And that's okay because we just started. So you can tell we're getting to a nice blue place. A little bit of a violet gray color going on here. All right, I'm gonna leave that in here. We'll check back in just a moment. We're gonna do the other sweater now. Okay, we're doing 2 sweaters at one time here, so I wanna get moving and get the other dye stock going so that I can be attending both of those sweaters at the same time. I don't wanna let anything sit for any length of time for too long without giving it a gentle stir. There is no heat on either of those right now, and I don't plan on adding heat for a good hour, and then I'll add heat gradually. So let's go ahead and mix the dye stock for that really pretty, let me grab the yarn so you can see it again, rust color that you see here. I'm gonna set this there so I can see it. Okay, so here's my jar. I have brick, bright orange, and my friend toner black. I am gonna begin with the lightest of these colors, the bright orange. That's going to serve as my overall undertone, and then I'm going to add on top of that. I'm gonna stick to a similar ratio that I did with the previous color, and I'm gonna do 1 teaspoon of this bright orange. Okay, now I'm not gonna go as big with this next one. This is that brick color. I'm gonna go light with this. I can add more of this as I need, but I'm gonna go light for now. So I'm gonna stick with a 1/16 of this brick color. Now I wanna see where this gets me before I add that black, just to see. So let's go ahead and add water to this. Now, as I'm mixing this, I want to mention that there's not as much yarn in this next sweater, so this is going to be more saturated in terms of ratio than my first sweater, and I'm okay with that. I feel much more confident about this. Not that I don't feel confident about the navy, but I definitely want to take my time with that navy. With this, I feel like we can go ahead and get a good saturation in there with this really pretty orange color. And now I'm ready to add this to the bath. All right, I need to take the sweater out of here. Put it in this bucket, but before I do that, I'm going to give this another stir. Again, there's no heat here. This is just dye in fresh water. There's no acid, there's no heat, nothing other than just time right now that's helping that dye adhere to that yarn. Be real gentle right now. Okay. Now let's get this sweater out of here, right in there. Okay, let's give it a good stir. All right, the saturation level of this dye bath right now is really not very high. You can see right through that jar of liquid. This is gonna just barely tint the sweater, so I'm definitely gonna need to add more. But let's get the sweater in there. We're gonna add it all at the same time and push it down in. You just gotta go at it. No fear. I'm feeling good about this. There's gonna be variegation in here. I mean, if I lift this out, but it's gonna be cool. I'm confident. I'm feeling confident. But I know that I'm gonna need more dye, for sure. I'm gonna need more over here too, but I'm definitely gonna need more here. I'm just kind of rotating it around to move it around in the water. Don't agitate it too much, just kind of gently moving it around in the water is great. Okay, I want to show you something here. This has only been sitting in here for 5 minutes, but I want to show you the fabric. Do you see this color? Isn't that beautiful? Now, when you look at that, you can see where the dark places are coming through. That's going to be really hard to cover unless I plan on dyeing this the darkest color that I see here. But I don't want that. I want like an overall color like this. And when I look at this, now it's going to dry shades lighter than what you see here. I feel like we're getting to the right place. And so I think what's going to happen here is I'm going to have an overall, from a galloping horse, I'm gonna have a color like this, but there's going to be variegation in there. So what I'm gonna do now is completely double up the amount of dye that I put in here and see where that gets us in terms of saturation at this point. Always considering it's gonna dry 3 or 4 shades lighter than you see it in the pot. Okay, so here is the new dye stock. I even added more of that brick color in here. Now I know the question's coming up, how are you supposed to add more dye now that you have your sweater in there? You have to be really careful and you have to move swiftly and gently, okay? So it's okay to go ahead and add the dye with the sweater somewhat in the pot, but what I'm going to do is kind of gather it to one side. This takes finesse and it takes confidence. And I'm gonna add the yarn to this side, like this, and then I'm gonna move the sweater through it. Don't stress, just get it through there. Move it gently through, just swirling it around. Nothing crazy. There's where we are right now, and there's still, considering that level of saturation on the yarn already, there's still a lot of color left in here. So right now, I'm gonna practice my patience and I'm going to let this sit. This is where we're going to leave it for right now. Now we're gonna do something similar to this sweater over here because we need to think about saturation levels on this sweater here. All right, in terms of this sweater, here's kind of where we are right now with saturation. I'm just gonna pull it up a little bit and let you look. You can kind of see it's still just a real pale kind of grayish purple. I am going to double up the saturation of this, adding a dye stock that is essentially double what I already added here, and I think we're gonna leave it at that point for now. All right, just like with the previous sweater, I'm gonna move this sweater all to one side. Add, scoop it up, and then move the sweater around. Don't stress. It's very easy to become stressed. All right, I need to leave well enough alone at this point, so here's where we are, and we have quite a bit of dye in the water that still needs to take up into the sweater. Now we let it sit without heat, just let it work on its own with nothing pushing it, and in a little while, about 2 hours, we'll add heat. All right, guys, we're back. I have gone ahead and turned on the heat. It's really low and slow going right now. I don't want to agitate this too much. Both of these sweaters were knit using non-superwash yarn, and I would be lying if I told you I wasn't a little bit nervous about this right now. I've never done this before, so I don't know if I mentioned that in the beginning, but I've never done this before, so I'm a little hesitant. So I am going to leave you now until they are finished absorbing all this dye, because I really do not want to just keep stirring it and doing checks, because that's only going to agitate the fabric more. So let's all cross our fingers, and I will see you on the other side. It has been hours. I've had a shower. The whole time that I've been doing this, I've kind of been pretty anxious about the sweaters, because I really don't want to felt them, and I don't have any experience over dyeing sweaters, and also too, I'm thinking like not only the having to stir them to make sure that it takes the dye, but I'm gonna have to rinse them, and because they're not superwash treated, they're more prone to felting if they're too agitated. So I've been very careful. I've been keeping it really low and slow. I've only been stirring it every so often, and when I do that, I stir very slowly. I'm not noticing anything right now that looks like felting, and I do know what felting looks like. I have felted at least 2, small batches of yarn in my time from just getting the heat too high, just whatever. The learning curve of learning how to dye yarn. It's happened. So I know what it looks like. And I also know what it looks like when an item that you have knit felts. And so I'm really trying my best not to go to that place, but I'm a little nervous about it. This is, I say no stress, this is definitely a stressful thing. So I will tell you, if you have a hand knit sweater that you want to over dye and it is an untreated, meaning non-superwash yarn, you really need to come at it delicately, carefully. You might just understand that you're taking a risk. And I'm definitely coming to grips with that. I feel okay. I'm starting to feel a little bit better about it as I've been looking at things, but in the beginning it was definitely nerve-wracking. Okay, I want to show you what it looks like so far. I'm just going to give you a little glimpse, and then we are going to add some citric acid and just let it keep going low and slow. This is the blue, and as much as I was expecting it to be kind of a navy blue, I mean, it's definitely a navy blue, but it's really kind of taken on that peacock blue, and I'm kind of obsessed with it. Let me adjust my lighting here, or actually my ISO settings on my camera, just so you can get a better idea of what we are working with. There we go, it should brighten it up a little bit. So let's go ahead and just get another glimpse of what we have here. So there's that color. We're getting there somewhat, quite a bit actually. And the water still has quite a bit of color in it. Now let's go over here. This is my orange, we'll say. And here we are so far. It's actually looking really beautiful. I'm really loving that. I'm just gonna give it a little gentle turn. The temperature is really low. I mean, this water is still, I can touch the side of the pan. I could touch the water if I wanted to. It's not burning my fingers or anything like that. So real gradual. So I'm gonna go ahead and add some citric acid to this, gently stir it in, and then we're just gonna let it keep going. It's probably not gonna be until tomorrow when I can be done with this. I'm not gonna let it stay on the burners on heat until tomorrow, but I'm gonna bring it up to the proper temperature tonight, and then I'm going to let it cool all the way completely until tomorrow. Good morning. I am back. It has been an entire night and overnight, and now it is morning time, and it's like 9:30 in the morning. the next day, and I am ready to talk a little bit about where we are with these overdyed sweaters. I was nervous last night. I knew that I was going to get them up to temp after adding citric acid like I showed you. I was going to shut them off and I was going to let them sit until they completely cooled to what is garage temperature, which is slightly warmer than room temperature, before I did anything with them. I needed to just be very, very patient because, like I had mentioned and expressed, I was a little bit anxious about potentially felting parts of the sweater, whatever. It's kind of been a nerve-wracking process. So let's go ahead and look at where we are with this so far. I've got my coffee because I think I'm like coming down with a little, not like cold, but like my allergies. It's been windy and dusty and ugh. Okay, so here is the big pot. This is the one that has, I'm gonna grab my, tongs over here. This is the one that has that rosy colored sweater. But as you can see here, it is not so rosy anymore. This is a rich, deep navy color that's gonna be really hard to see right now. And what's great about this one is that the water from this pot is clear. All of that dye has exhausted and this is done. So this sweater is good to go. We're gonna leave it. Well, we're not gonna leave it. I'm gonna pull it out. We're gonna wash it in just a moment. But let's go ahead and look over here at the other sweater. Now this is the one, again, I was trying to get that really pretty orange. And I did indeed. Let me dial up the ISO here just a little bit so you can see better. Like, look at that. Beautiful. The only thing here is that there is quite a bit of color left in the water, and I have a plan for that, but I want to talk a little bit about that plan for just a second. Okay, so when I set out to dye both of these sweaters, I kind of knew that if for whatever reason the dye didn't take up fully into the sweater and there was some residual dye left, that I would use some yarn that I have on hand here and soak up the remaining dye. If you're familiar with Fiber for the People, my hand-dyed yarn company, you may be familiar with my Lucky Strike colorways. That's exactly what those are. They are one-of-a-kind tonal colorways that I create by using, wherever there's instances of remaining dye in the water, I use these skeins of yarn to absorb that remaining dye so nothing goes to waste. Sometimes it happens where you have some remaining dye left in the water, it doesn't completely exhaust, and you need to have a way to use that dye without sending it down the drain. And so I have a way of doing that. So I kind of knew going into this that if that were to happen, I had some dye or some yarn, and it's actually in this bucket here soaking. So I had this ready, and I forgot to mention this, it just kind of becomes second nature. But I had this ready to go, some yarn soaking in here that I would add to the dye bath to take up any additional color. And actually, in fact, this yarn is yarn that I already have dyed once as a Lucky Strike, but I'm less than thrilled with the color and it's still very faint. So I figured I'm gonna go ahead and just dip it in to absorb some additional layers of color and make something really beautiful. So that's my plan, and that's actually going to be what happens with that orange sweater, because there's a significant amount of color left in this water. I mean, quite a significant amount. I overestimated how much dye I was going to need for that sweater by a good deal. And I was okay with that because I knew that I had an alternative, or at least I knew I had a solution and that dye wasn't going to go down the drain. But here's the point of me telling you this. If you are not a yarn dyer and you don't have a lot of extra yarn available to dye to absorb all of that dye, what are you supposed to do with what's left there? And because that's a thing, you don't want to send that down the drain because it's just wasteful. You want to have kind of you want to be prepared for that possibility. And so that just means that you want to make sure you're using less in the beginning. And do you remember when I said that I'm going to use the same ratio of dye to, essentially the sweater in the smaller sweater that I was using in the larger sweater? You may remember me saying that I was doing that, but I felt pretty good about it because I think it'll give me the right saturation level. Well, that was kind of a mistake. Like, I feel like that point I should have stopped and been like, no, do as you say to do and start small, because I didn't have that problem with this navy sweater here. Everything is exhausted, the water is clear. but I did have it with that smaller sweater. And so had I heeded my own warning, I wouldn't have this extra dye in the water here. Thankfully, I have a solution for that, but you at home may not have an easy solution. A quick solution for that is to go find some yarn in your stash that you like, that you don't really care for the color all that much, and stick it in there and see what you can come up with. But because we don't necessarily always have that there as an available option, start with the smallest amount of dye, because you can always add more. I can't take away, and I'm just, fortunately I have a solution. So that's my whole point in saying that. So I will be using up the last remaining bit of dye in that pot with these skeins of yarn here. Nothing goes to waste. The water is used again. All good in the hood. I had to make a decision just now because of how much dye was left in that orange dye bath, and because of how much of that dye was left in the garment because just being wet with it. When I put it in the rinse water, it kind of released a lot of that orange dye into the water. And so what I'm gonna do, because I don't want it to continually have, you might be hearing my burner warming up. I don't want it to continually have a bleeding problem because of how much of that it held on to just by being wet with it. I added it, now you can see this pot right here. I added the sweater to this water here with a good amount of citric acid, about 2 to 3 tablespoons of citric acid. I'm gonna bring this up to temperature, 2 to 3 teaspoons of citric acid, I apologize. I'm going to bring this up to temperature, and I'm going to have it fix whatever is left in that fabric from just being wet with that dye stock to the sweater. And then once I know that all of that is fixed to the sweater, then I will put it through the rinsing. I'm gonna bring this up to temperature gradually. What's going to happen here is the water is going to take on an orange tint because the heat is going to draw that residual dye out of the fabric, the dye that did not fix to the sweater because of what was left over in the pot. And then because of the citric acid and then that temperature, it's gonna get sucked right back into the fiber, and then it will be there for good with no bleeding. You can do that at home if you have a pot that's just used for this sort of application. You can put that sweater into a pot like the one I have right here, fill it with cold water, add citric acid to it or vinegar, and then you bring it up to temperature gradually, and it will help to fix whatever is bleeding out of that sweater back into the sweater. It's just the nature of anything dyed, anything, whether it's commercially dyed or dyed by hand, there's going to be bleeding that happens with really highly saturated colors. Knowing how you can kind of do a little extra something at home to make sure that that bleeding doesn't continue, that's always an option. You can even do that with the yarn in its skein if you get it and you think that maybe the color is super saturated and you're gonna use it in a color work project and you really wanna make sure it doesn't bleed, soak it in citric acid in hot water or gradually bring it up to hot water and allow that extra residual dye that may bleed to fix to the yarn. So that is what I'm doing with the orange sweater. So it's in here. This is just clear water right now. However, as it's starting to heat up, I'm noticing a little bit of that orange releasing from the sweater.
What are you doing?
Hi. Okay, it has been about 15 minutes. My blue sweater has been soaking in just clear, plain water. And I don't want to transfer it into any new water right now. And I think what I'm gonna do is, because it's not bleeding out any color into this clear water, it's still staying relatively, well, hold on, there's like blue dye in the bottom of this jar, so this is not a very good example. Just a minute. Okay, let's look at the water. Yeah, so you can see here, the water is clear. This is not leaching out any color, which is great. So instead of transferring it into another bucket of water, I'm just gonna add my wool wash directly in here, scrubble my hands around in the water a little bit, and then let it soak in the wool wash. So this, what I'm using right now, part in the bottle, I use it a lot in the garage, it gets dirty. This is Euclid. It's my favorite wool wash. I use it to soak my yarns. I have this lavender scent, and then I have one that's unscented, and I love it. So I just put a little bit in here. Rub it in my hands like you're washing your hands, and then rinse your hands in the bucket. And I do about what would equate to like a half of a pump of that for just this sweater. And that's plenty. Okay, now I'm gonna leave this for about 15 minutes. And then the moment of truth, I am going to spin it out in my spin dryer. Fingers crossed. Okay, my sweater is in the spin dryer. Can't really make it out too well inside there. You can see a little tiny bit of it in there. But I am going to, I've added it into the spin dryer carefully and kind of evenly distributed the weight. And then I'm going to stick a towel over the top of the sweater like that. Kind of see it in there. And I push that down over the top, and that helps to kind of just keep everything compact. I'm going to close the lid and get to spinning. Okay, I'm here. I have my sweater. This is my bigger sweater. The other one is still out there on the burner right now, so I'm letting that work. But I am so excited about this, you guys. I'm not going to show you too much right now. I kind of want to wait until it's finished blocking, but just boop, peek, look at that. It's not felted. It didn't shrink. Everything looks beautiful. But what I'm going to do right now is lay it out on my rug in my office here. It is damp. It's not wet like it would be if I hadn't used the spin dryer. So I'm okay just laying it out on the rug. It is incredibly dry here right now. I mean, it's July in the Mojave Desert, but it's particularly dry these last few days. So this thing is going to dry really fast. So I'm going to go ahead and block it, get it all put to shape, shape it out on the floor, let it dry completely. I'm going to do the same thing with the other sweater when it's finished. And then when it's all finished, I will be back to share with you the final reveal.